So now I'd like to turn it over to Professors Allen and Presser. I'll let you go in whichever order you would like to make your opening remarks, and then we will have plenty of time before we wrap it up tonight to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Can you hear me in the background? I'll try to stay away from that. All right, here we go. I'm going to use the PowerPoint, and William has heard this before, but just in case you haven't, I learned a really interesting aphorism last week, and that was that power corrupts, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. I have been thoroughly corrupted, and I have a lot of fun with this. It is true. You can see if we can get it to work. There we go. That's me. And if this works, that's William. And this is actually the first time that the two of us have ever appeared on a stage together, so it's extremely exciting. I'm going to have the first presentation. I'll talk for about 20 minutes or so about the history, past of impeachment, and William will talk a little bit about the present and future, and then we'll take questions. Now, the focus of this, of course, is on that. We've heard that if the Democrats take the House, we can expect him to be impeached. I think that's probably likely. But my focus, to a great extent today, is going to be on this man, who you may remember. That's Hillary Clinton's husband. He was president of the country for a little while, and he was, in fact, impeached. I was one of 19 scholars who went down to Washington to advise the Congress exactly what was an impeachable offense and what wasn't. And the presentation that I'm going to give you today is pretty much taken from that testimony. Now, let's put it in a little bit of perspective. There have been other very important officials who in the past have been impeached. One of those is Samuel Chase, a Supreme Court justice, and there's his picture. And the other, of course, is Andrew Johnson, President of the United States. Now, remember, impeachment is a two-step, or is often popularly thought of as a two-step process. The House of Representatives votes by a majority to bring charges, and then the Senate hears those charges, but it takes a 2/3 vote to convict. And it's very difficult to do that conviction. In fact, neither of these men was convicted. No president has yet been convicted by the Senate. Speculation is Richard Nixon might have been, but of course he resigned before impeachment proceedings could be brought against him. Now, the most important thing to bear in mind is a statement made by Gerald Ford when he was vice president. He was contemplating the impeachment of Chief Justice Earl Warren of the United States Supreme Court. And he said, in very important words, impeachment is anything a majority of the House of Representatives thinks it is. And he's right, of course. There is no body, not the Supreme Court, not the Hague, no one who can overrule the House of Representatives if they bring impeachment charges. Still, I think there is some content to the constitutional provision. Let's put it up and let's think about it. Article 2, Section 4 says, the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, what does that mean? That's what Congress wanted to know. That's what it took 19 of us to tell them. And it's pretty difficult to figure out. Now, the obvious question is, who ought to decide what it means? And again, it's pretty clear. It's simply a majority of the House of Representatives. But let me give you a little bit of history and background. If you take a look at the constitutional convention, you will find that the initial draft of the impeachment clause would have allowed impeachment and removal for malpractice or neglect of duty. A number of the framers thought that's much too low a standard. That means whenever Congress wants to remove a chief executive or a judge or any other official subject to impeachment, they can do it. They can concoct clearly anything to fit within that. So that was thrown out, and what was substituted was treason, bribery, and corruption. Then no one was quite sure what corruption meant, so they dropped it down to treason and bribery. Then that didn't seem to be enough, so they changed it to treason, bribery, or maladministration. George Mason of Virginia was the one who proposed that language. Madison freaked. That's too unclear. What is maladministration? We've got to get rid of that. So the next phrase was treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors against the state. That seemed a little bit more substantive. But then that seemed a little bit too broad. So it was tightened to treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors against the United States. And finally, it was reduced to what we have now: treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, intriguingly enough, that last change to remove misdemeanors to remove against the United States was done by the Committee on Style and Arrangement, which wasn't supposed to make substantive changes, but occasionally it did. So I think probably the deleting against the United States was designed a little bit to broaden the clause and to make it possible, perhaps, to remove somebody, not necessarily for acts done against the United States, right? More about that in just a minute. When you want to know what the Constitution means, there's a wonderful place that you can go. It is, of course, the Federalist, sometimes called the Federalist Papers, written jointly by those three extraordinary framers: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. It is a sensational book. It is the single greatest work of political science ever written by Americans. If you have trouble sleeping, I recommend it. It's very, very difficult to get through, but it's really good, and it rewards spending a lot of time with it. It's an amazing, amazing volume. I could go on rapturously for a long time, but I won't. Now, if you look into the Federalist and see what it says about impeachment, you get a very clear sense that impeachment is about the character of federal officials. I think it's persuasive authority for believing that when it becomes clear that a judge or president, and I told the House of Representatives Committee on the Judiciary this, when it becomes clear that a judge or president has committed acts that raise grave doubts about his honesty, his virtue, or his honor, impeachment is available as a remedy. Okay? That's in the Federalist. There's one other useful source of what the constitutional meaning is, and that's the English experience. Here's Justice Joseph Story, who wrote a tremendous book on the Constitution in 1833. And he summarized the English experience. He said, "Lord chancellors and judges and other magistrates have not only been impeached for bribery and acting grossly contrary to the duties of their office, but for misleading their sovereign by unconstitutional opinions and for attempts to subvert the fundamental laws and introduce arbitrary power." To put that slightly differently, this means acts that are inconsistent with the obligations and duties of office, that involve putting personal or partisan concerns ahead of the interests of people, and that demonstrate the unfitness of the person to the office. Okay? So, that of course leads us to ask, what about Bill and Monica? and there's the happy couple. How come that ended up as impeachment? Now, the popular conception was that Clinton was impeached because he was involved with a White House intern. However, he had been under investigation by Kenneth Starr for shady land deals and for other misconduct, including, of course, the death of Vincent Foster, and just to bring things right into present, you may remember that Brett Kavanaugh was working with Kenneth Starr on that very investigation, which is why he said last Thursday that maybe part of this was revenge from the Clintons. But let's be serious here. He wasn't impeached simply for fooling around with an intern. It's an interesting question whether that would have been impeachment grounds. Anyway, what was he impeached for? Well, he was impeached for misconduct in connection with the Paula Jones suit brought against him. That was a private lawsuit. And in the course of depositions for that lawsuit, President Clinton was asked, among other things, is it true that you are having a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky? Now, he was sitting in a chair in a grand jury room at that point, and the president answered, it depends on what the meaning of is. Meaning at the moment, no, he was not involved in a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky. He was sitting in a chair in a grand jury room. Sometimes we call that Clintonian parsing of the truth. But I think you know most of this. He at least misled the lawyers for the other side and the judge. Then, when a grand jury investigated, a criminal grand jury, Mr. Clinton lied to the grand jury. He tried to get others to lie to protect him, for example, Ms. Lewinsky. He tried to get her to conceal the gifts that he had given her. He lied to still others like Sidney Blumenthal, hoping they'd repeat the lies, and Mr. Blumenthal did, and he lied to congressional investigators. Now, that's pretty bad. What can one say about that? I've always found this next quote to be pretty interesting on this point. This is from Richard Posner, who is one of the greatest judges of our era, one of the greatest law professors of our era, and one of the most prolific authors, certainly in the academy, if not, if not in the country. It is said, by the way, of Richard Posner, that he writes at least one book before breakfast every day. He said of the Clinton impeachment, and read this with me, it's pretty interesting. In one of two possible narratives, a reckless, lawless, immoral president commits a series of crimes in order to conceal a tawdry and shameful affair. Crimes compounded by a campaign of public lying and slanders. A prosecutor could easily draw up a 30-count indictment against the president. In the other narrative, the confluence of a stupid law, the independent counsel law that created Kenneth Starr, a marginal lawsuit begotten and nursed by political partisanship, the Paula Jones suit. This is great sitcom coming from a sitting Board of Appeals judge, a naive and imprudent judicial decision by the Supreme Court in that suit, which said the Paula Jones lawsuit could go forward, and the irresistible human impulse to conceal one's sexual improprieties allows a trivial sexual escapade, what Clinton and Lewinsky called fooling around or messing around, to balloon into a grotesque and gratuitous constitutional drama. The problem is that both narratives are correct. Now, are both of those narratives actually correct? Of course not. Posner, I think, is coming from the academic sort of post-truth era. But I think one of those is probably closer to the truth than the other. Which one was it? We'll think about that for a little bit. Which one was it? Which narrative is correct? That's Arthur Schlesinger Jr. He was another one of the 19 scholars who went down to testify about what constituted an impeachable offense. He said, this surely isn't one. This isn't one, he said, because gentlemen lied about sex. Someone who I admire, actually much more than I admire Arthur Schlesinger Jr., was Cass Sunstein, a professor in Chicago, who had the Democrats won the last election, might well be a Supreme Court candidate. Sunstein, I think a little bit more thoughtful, said, no, this is not an impeachable offense, whatever it is that Mr. Clinton did, because impeachable offenses involve public matters. They involve the way the president does his job. We mustn't let the House and Senate too easily remove, or the constitutional scheme of separation of powers will fail, and the constitutional practice of periodic elections won't really be allowed to function. Now, I think that's a pretty powerful argument, and indeed it tracks a little bit some of the legislative history that I showed you before. As I say, I admire Cass Sunstein a whole lot. He said further, this business involving Monica was a private matter. It's kind of like a traffic ticket. Shouldn't be an impeachable offense. Now that leads you to wonder, what sort of crimes committed by the president would be impeachable offenses, not traffic tickets? Maybe not this, but think about it. Suppose the president commits murder and lies about that. Wouldn't that be an impeachable offense? Suppose the president commits rape, lies about it, or even just commits it. Would that be an impeachable offense? Suppose the president commits sexual harassment. Is that an impeachable offense? You can see where we're going down the slippery slope. It's a nice problem, a very nice problem. And like all law professors, all I do is raise questions. I don't answer anything. But let's go a little bit further back in history and think about this. I later wrote a law review article based on my congressional testimony. And the title of the law review article is, Would George Washington have wanted Bill Clinton to be impeached? I said, yes, of course. Anybody can see that. Why? Well, what's the argument? I think the president was certainly impeachable if what we're after in this process, as the Federalists tried to suggest that we are, is about character and an ability to put the people's interests ahead of yours. I think Bill Clinton really didn't have it. Now, in order to make that argument, you've got to say something like Richard Blumenthal said, questioning, I thought relatively improperly, Brett Kavanaugh. The phrase here is, if you can't trust the president on small things, you can't trust him on big ones. I think the framers, by the way, understood that. And I think their focus on character is about that. On the other hand, I'm not 100% certain that George Washington would have been on board to impeach Bill Clinton. And the reason for that is the framers did understand some difference between public and private acts. Nevertheless, they placed a lot of stock in the oath. And really what happened in Clinton's case is it was his failure to take the oath seriously that got him into trouble. So I think there's a good argument that framers would have been sympathetic to the Bill Clinton impeachment proceedings. But you need to be reminded what finally happened. What did the Senate do in Bill Clinton's case? They acquitted him, or to be more precise, they failed to convict him. Only half the Senate, on what I think was a pretty clear perjury and obstruction of justice case, thought that amounted to an impeachable offense. One might ask then, what happened to the Senate as persons of honor? Now, the short answer to that is the 17th Amendment. That required the direct election senators. It made of the Senate a much more political party than it used, a much more political body than it used to be. What's the Senate supposed to be all about? What's the impeachment process supposed to be all about? Well, I do think that the impeachment process and the Senate, and indeed the Constitution, is supposed to be telling us that pure democracy and pure politics is not all there is. And further, that impeachment and everything else, confirming judges, should not simply be dictated by partisan politics. Is law simply politics? The critical legal studies people tell us, yes, it is. That's all it is. I think that's wrong. I think in the vernacular that we use these days, we're better than that. And that's all I have to say about the history. That's
That's a wonderful display of what a law professor can do. But when they set out to tell you the history of these important questions, it is almost impossible to conclude by the time they're done that there's anything left to do on the subject. Nevertheless, I have an obligation to fulfill. So I will do my best to carry that out in the spirit that Steve has certainly brought before us in a very comprehensive account. Yet, I am also a political philosopher as well as a political historian, and there's something you may say about them also. They're never at a loss for words. So even when the subject has been exhausted, expect to settle in for a while. But before I say any of that, I want to just thank you for the invitation, particularly because it was just splendid to enjoy the arboreal goldenness of the drive up. I really appreciate you giving my wife and me that opportunity today. Impeachment, impeachment, impeachment. It's almost enough to say Trump to say impeachment, given the vernacular. But as you saw in the presentation we just had, there are serious questions about what was meant and what is impeachable. So let me get to the bottom line, and I'll explain it to you after I've told you what it is. Anything is an impeachable offense. Impeachment is not a legal matter. It's not a historical matter. It's a political matter. Pure and simple. You want to impeach President Trump? All you need is the political power to do so. You must control the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the vote in the Senate. And whatever reason you have for impeachment is justifiable under the Constitution. So why do I say that? We can see the provision in the Constitution set before you in the PowerPoint. Actually, that's only one of the provisions in the Constitution. There are several, strewn across several parts. The part that assigns the duty to the House of Representatives to charge is in Article 1, of course, a section dealing with the House of Representatives. And the section that deals with the Senate's trial comes, of course, in the second part of that Article 1. And these are separated out. Moreover, the question of who can be removed by impeachment is an open question. Article 2, Section 4 is in the part of the Constitution devoted to the executive. You saw the language. It says, civil officers can be removed by impeachment. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say what a civil officer is, nor in British or English history, nor in any of the commentaries. It is an open question. By implication, it may mean only executive officers, given the structure of the Constitution and where the clause falls, the president and those who answer to the president. That would mean judges could not be impeached. But we've seen judges impeached and convicted, which means, of course, that the interpretation of this provision of the Constitution has been at sea. How much at sea? The language which provides for impeachment says there's only one response to impeachment if the person impeached is convicted. They are removed from office and barred from holding any office of honor or profit under the United States. That's the literal language. But we have had people convicted of impeachment who were removed from office and explicitly by the Senate not barred from holding office. Alcee Hastings, just a few years ago, was a federal judge who was charged criminally and acquitted. Primarily because witnesses didn't show up. He was also impeached when he was acquitted of a criminal charge by the House, tried in the Senate, convicted. But the Senate who convicted him said he was not barred from holding office, which means we have to question, did the Senate follow the Constitution? Moreover, they convicted him in a committee, not in the full Senate, subject to the two-thirds vote requirement. In other words, the real history tells us that the people who are there when the moment comes to pose the question of impeachment will make their decisions as far as possible on political grounds. And yes, some of them are going to take seriously the important criminal and moral and character issues, but there is no way legally to enforce that consideration. It is an appeal to people's character that they judge wisely and well. But there is no constitutional provision to guarantee judging wisely and well. And impeachment is precisely set outside of the legal procedure, partly for that reason. It is rather part of the deliberative structure of the government put together. And so when I say this, you may wonder, well, did the founders really intend to make this a wide open invitation, a Pandora's box, anyone might imagine to become impeachable, and therefore the fact that Trump has what some people consider to be oddly colored hair would be sufficient reason to impeach him? Well, not exactly. We must pay attention to the process, and Steve did a wonderful job of showing us how important that is. Because you cannot convict without a supermajority in the Senate. Which means to say, you can exonerate on a partisan basis, but you can't convict on a partisan basis. It takes the overwhelming judgment of the structures of government under the Constitution actually to convict. And if that happens, you cannot call it partisan. You have to call it broadly the sentiment, the opinion of the community. But any exoneration could be called partisan, because it only takes 1/6 of the entire Congress to accomplish. That is to say, 1/3 plus 1 in the Senate, out of all the members of the House and all the members of the Senate, are sufficient to exonerate. And you can always get a partisan group of that size together, almost anywhere you want to, any day of the week. So what the framers did was precisely to make exoneration easier than conviction. That's the secret to impeachment. That is the clue to what the Constitution aims to do. It doesn't tell us or provide directives for the outcomes and judgments we're supposed to make, but it makes it very hard for us to make those judgments effective without talking to one another and without reaching broad agreement and consensus about what ought to be done. Just as in the matter of amending the Constitution, we want overwhelming majorities, not mere majorities. Because we want our community and the people moved by deliberative consideration of the alternatives that lie before them. So impeachment, for today and yesterday, is always going to be a similar project in the United States, as it was in the case of Andrew Johnson. And remember something, impeachment is not a way to achieve partisan objectives, ordinarily speaking. In Johnson's case, yes, he would have been succeeded in the presidency by someone who disagreed with him radically politically. That was Representative Wade, Speaker, who was a radical Republican, a Reconstructionist, very much opposed to Johnson. He would have become president had Johnson been convicted. But ordinarily, I think that the president means succession by someone of the same political persuasion, a vice president. And so you are going to accomplish a partisan purpose by convicting someone. And you can achieve a partisan purpose by exonerating someone. Which means, therefore, that minorities have an outsized voice in the politics of the United States. They can gum up the works. they can prevent even obvious cases, such as the indiscretions of President Clinton that were referenced, taking action upon them. For no better reason than that, we do not have a broad social consensus that this was something more than insubstantial. And as long as we think something insubstantial, we think the Constitution, the country, our politics, our comity are all too important to take such extraordinary steps as impeachment would represent. Now, there are some people who imagine, I'm going to close with this, that the way we approach impeachment, because we see it's politically wide open and you don't need to justify it. With all due respect to our law professors who exist for the purpose of justification. You don't need a justification. You can claim outright you want to impeach someone for any reason whatsoever. And some people say, well, if we actually did that, we would turn impeachment into a no confidence vote. And that would turn our political system into a parliamentary system, like the systems we know abroad, and particularly in Western Europe. And that might conceivably be true if you didn't have the safeguards I have been describing, which make impeachment practically impossible. Why are judges impeached? Because the judges don't matter. Things that matter, don't expect impeachment.
I will let that slight law professor pass. And maybe we can open it up to questions. And I think William and I are prepared to talk about anything. Don't hesitate.
I have a question. The words high crimes and misdemeanors.
Yeah,
Misdemeanor to me sounds like a low crime.
it does. Now, that's a phenomenon of the 18th century language. In a way, though, we're a little uncertain, but as near as I can figure out, what misdemeanors meant was truly bad misdeeds, not necessarily minor crimes. So that, and the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors is a British phrase going back hundreds of years, referring to terrible misconduct, I'd say. So it's a very good point.
Thank you. You both touched on kind of the downside of going through the process, and yet it's, people bring it up. So what do you hope to gain if you think you can get impeachment but not conviction?
I'll speak to that from a political perspective. There are times in which you might want to accomplish an influence on public opinion. And there are certainly measures you will undertake that have that political objective and not an actual decision to result. We see this often at the state level with initiative and referenda. Sometimes they're filed because people actually want them to be voted into law. Sometimes they're filed for other motives and to have an influence on public opinion. Similarly with impeachment, similarly with the kind of debates that are taking place at present with regard to political vacancy on the Supreme Court. So we can never really in politics take things at face value. We must always consider the face value of everything, but we must also understand that some things are done for rather exquisite political reasons and not directly expressed. And that can easily happen in cases of impeachment.
And just to add to that, even of course if you're not removed, it's a messy, horrible process. And it can affect what happens to you. Samuel Chase, after he was impeached, was a whole lot quieter and pretty much stayed out of trouble. And as a matter of fact, it's sometimes suggested that the effort to impeach Samuel Chase made John Marshall much more cautious and much more adept at trying to keep the Supreme Court out of politics. So there's ramifications. I didn't get the feeling that Bill Clinton was particularly chastened by the impeachment proceedings.
Notice the irony in that statement, which I agree with completely. But when we say, therefore, judges become modest and stay out of politics because they see themselves as vulnerable, What we're describing is just how political they are.
More? Yes, sir.
I just briefly read about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and JFK spoke to his brother Bobby, and just before the embargo of Cuba went up, or the barricade, and he told him if this goes wrong, I could be impeached, and Bobby agreed with him. But, and looking at that, what could have happened during that makes Clinton and Nixon and everything they put together look pretty small.
Given the world might have blown up.
Exactly.
But a great illustration of that story, of course, is that people go into office mindful of just such things, what may and may not have them in the future. And there's another question I should put on the table for you that is worth reflecting, which we never really talk about, but which may help you to understand the impeachment provision in the Constitution itself. And that is the question, can members of the House or Senate be impeached? Now, there are specific provisions in the Constitution for removal of members of the House and Senate by the respective bodies themselves. By implication, they are not subject to impeachment. If they are not subject to impeachment, then impeachment is really focused only on certain kinds of officials, and officials who are expected to be accountable in the performance of their duties, not the expression of their opinions. Thus, you begin to narrow down what might be a reasonable basis for impeachment. Somehow the failure to perform the duties appropriately is more important than whether it has this or that particular view.
How do you see this pursuit of the suit on the emoluments clause playing into this?
I'll tell you how I see that. I think that's the greatest folly that we have seen some underemployed lawyers come up with for a long time. Including the most recent ethics lawyers out of the last two administrations, Painter and the other president's name I don't remember. Look, if the emoluments clause had the kind of punch these people said it has, there are people throughout the federal government who would be disqualified from serving in the offices, civil service as well as others. Why? Because they are drawing pensions that dabble in emerging markets and sovereign wealth funds and are receiving emoluments from foreign governments. It is pervasive throughout our society. So these people who suddenly want to raise an unenforced clause and say it's an objection against President Trump have blinded themselves to the reality that they have named something for which virtually everybody would have to be removed from office. We took it seriously. Don't take it seriously.
I certainly wish I'd said all that. There oddly enough William is right. There are two lawyers in the George W. Bush administration who have been pushing this. They're completely wrong. There's a very obscure law professor at an equally obscure university, I think in Ireland, who's written some powerful law review articles in very dense law professorese, showing why it's a joke. It's prosecution. Your instincts, in other words.
And I can't help but pointing out that when we had a president who was distinguished by receiving a very rich award for doing nothing, it provided the emolument clause on these interpretations. It doesn't matter if it gave to charity, it was given to him, it would have violated the emoluments clause.
Yes, ma'am.
Some in the Senate Judiciary Committee said that if Justice Kavanaugh was confirmed, that they would pursue impeachment. What's the likelihood of that, and what do you feel about that? It's very troubling.
Yeah,
I would put it on a scale that allows you to assess the likelihood of it.
I'm sorry?
I will allow you to assess the likelihood of it on the following scale. The charges against Judge Kavanaugh are charges which are subject to prosecution still in Montgomery County, Maryland. Anyone can file a bill of particulars, a claim, and have it criminally enforced. They could have done that July the 30th, every day since then, and and every day hereafter, even if it's confirmed. So the real question is, if you're that determined to prove his guilt, would you file a bill of impeachment, or would you go to the district attorney and say prosecute? You judge.
I'd add to that. I think it really depends on whether there's a blue wave or whether there's not in the congressional election. I would guess that these folks who would see Dr. Kavanaugh would, pardon the expression, get some trumped up charges based on the allegation that he lied to the Senate Judiciary Committee. I don't think he did. I think that's a tremendous loser. But I think that may well be the hook that they use. They could only pull this off if they got a substantial majority, I think.
Steve, I'm going to make a prediction for you that there will not be a blue wave. I will tell you why. There was a potential blue wave until this happened.
Yeah.
I think the reaction against the excesses of the opposition have canceled the blue wave. And the only question now is will it turn into a red wave. Take my word for it.
Well, you don't. I've learned already in just a few weeks of being together, you don't make mistakes. So I don't think it'll happen, but we'll see.
Could it be the thing with Kavanaugh? It's really what nobody's talking about, that decisions like Roe versus Wade would possibly be overturned, or Second Amendment issues, that if Kavanaugh gets in there, then for a good while, there's going to be a law.
I'll take a shot. I mean, what you say is absolutely correct. The stirring in the pot of getting the troops enraged is always around Roe versus Wade, and is always around abortion. Now, a couple of comments on that. Comment one, Roe versus Wade is not going to be overruled, at least for the next decade or so, not while John Roberts sits as Chief Justice. I have a deeper explanation for what's going on. I think the left thought that it had won the culture wars. And then Trump got elected, and then Trump began to take seriously the idea of turning around the jurisprudence in this country. So it's not just Roe versus Wade, it's the whole idea of a living constitution or originalism, and it's a major rethinking of what the Supreme Court ought to be doing. I think it's no coincidence that you can quickly drum up 900 law professors to say, oh, we can't possibly have this guy on the Supreme Court, because that view, the living constitution view, has completely taken over the academy and orthodox legal thinking. It's only a few brave souls like William and me who think differently about it. But it's a deep jurisprudential issue. Roe versus Wade is part of it, but it's only a part of it.
And let me extend that into the realm of politics. It seems to me that, yes, Roe v. Wade is the target that is being used to activate a political base. But I think it's a mistake to think that they are only imposing Kavanaugh to protect Roe v. Wade. I would expect, knowing that they're 2 years ahead of us, and not expected to turn the Senate over even if you have a blue wave in the South, they know eventually someone's going to confirm that they are not going to be comfortable with it. So why are they doing this, and why are they throwing everything out? I think there's a simple explanation. The Democratic Party lost in 2016 because it lost its way. It abandoned certain people in this country, mainly white working people, in a significant way. And not only white working people, which is an important argument, but those people in the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, who voted for Barack Obama. So they didn't just lose people who've been hurt by the economy, they lost people who had a certain hope and thought we had entered an era of reconciliation and redemption. And the Democrats' failure in the 8 years of President Obama to deliver on that promise is what cost them the election in 2016. And so now they're trying to figure out how to come back. And rather than going back to those people who abandoned them, they want to try to create a larger majority of people who can be stirred up with the most extreme arguments that they use. They're taking the point of view that we have people who didn't show up to vote. Yes, we lost some people we used to have, but there are other people who we just turn them out in sufficient numbers, we can once again establish our political authority. And they're using Roe v. Wade and such issues to try to energize a new base to redefine the Democratic Party, having accepted once and for all, it's no longer the party of the working man. That's what's going on.
I'll buy a second. I'll speak louder. You use very persuasively the famous examples of like Andrew Johnson and impeachment and all like that. Are there any instructive examples of non-impeachment where we, thought it might happen and everybody was stirred up, but then they stepped back and said, no, we're not going to do it?
What a great question. The closest that I can come is Nixon.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing.
But I can't think of an instance in which somebody was a target, but then they dropped the impeachment. So I'm not.
No, I can't think of one. There might have been some desire, but never anything that gelled.
Well, actually, now that I think about it, there was a very brief movement that John Conyers led for a little while during W's administration. And for a while, when the Democrats had some control of the committees, and this was the second time that I was brought down to Congress to testify on impeachment. Interesting enough, I said, Clinton, yes, this guy, no. But then it was flirted with, but it didn't go anywhere.
But do remember, even at this hour, there are people in the Democratic Party who are arguing against Maxine Waters that you should drop that. We've got a differing fish we want to go after. So let's put that aside. So you see that working out before you. Some people say, no, let's drop it.
But is that because they really feel that way, or it's a political tactic?
Yeah, in politics you choose your battles. And you don't want to multiply your enemies. You want to be able to focus your enemies. But some people are just taking this to heart and saying, look, we don't want to fight that fight. There are other fights. We've got to get suburban women, we've got to get them inspired by direct appeals to women to come out. We've got to get college-educated people. We've got to win back that portion of the female vote that went for Donald Trump. And we've got to tie them off from the people they're now associated with to be in power again. Don't distract us with these other topics. Don't distract us with impeachment, et cetera, et cetera.
And it would be a tragedy if every time you have a house of a different party than the president, they bring impeachment charges.
Yeah.
And that's a risk.
Mentioned earlier in the presentation that, if I understood it correctly, it hasn't been used in some what I call administrative cases, and I'm thinking today, Rosenstein, McCabe, going back to Lois Lerner, those sort of clear violations of an oath of office and her duty and so on. And today, just to mention a couple names, is that an appropriate approach with impeachment?
Might be. I mean, I think it
certainly could, but you must remember that Congress has not been able to act in a forthright way in these kinds of situations. What they try to do is to act through the executive as much as possible, which is why they have delegated so much congressional power to administrative agencies and others. They hamstrung themselves with a number of procedures. And so when it comes to removing either a political appointee or a civil servant, the structures in place supersede any potential appeal to an impeachment unless the circumstances are so egregious, so outrageous, that the members of Congress would have to act out of self-defense.
There's also just an added thing to think about. In the case of the folks you mentioned, Lise McCabe and Rosenstein, and a few others, part of the problem there is the institution of the special prosecutor. which I think is, some people have argued is clearly unconstitutional. It's been in various forms, but it's a dumb idea. And it may be that that's the real cause, and maybe that's why there haven't been serious impeachment proceedings even contemplated, besides the simple fact that William points out that the president could fire those guys.
Well, I was just going to say, to add the historical note, in the very first Congress in 1789, there was a debate about who could remove executive officers. And the Congress itself accepted the proposition that that was the authority of the president. So you've got this very complicated picture where you wouldn't want to initiate an impeachment proceedings because that would mean you were superseding the authority of the executive to direct the executive branch. That's another reason not to do it that way.
And to bring everything full circle, we mustn't forget that Andrew Johnson was impeached because he wouldn't go along with a congressional statute forbidding him from removing cabinet officials.
Right, exactly.
What did he fire the secretary?
He fired Edwin Stanton, was that the guy's name? The Secretary of War, I guess.
Edwin Stanton, who was starting from the Buchanan administration, this is just a footnote, so it's not important, you don't have to worry about it. But you've heard about the anonymous member of the administration who has expressed his misgivings about the president, etc. Well, that was Edwin Stanton from the Buchanan administration wall. So somebody finally fired him.
Yep.
What role in today's world does the media play from two perspectives? One, there's always been yellow journalism, and all the way back to William Randolph Hearst, and so that's hyped stories that could be fake news back then, clearly. But now we have a media that everyone talks about with live examples that is seemingly tracking down one side of the fence instead of the other. And then you have social media that none of us in this room control that has an impact on people's thinking. So, well, what's your opinion on the two?
I've got a couple of minutes. It doesn't go back to William Randolph Hearst. It goes all the way back to the 1790s. And the contest in particular between Jefferson and Adams in, what was it, 1800 or so. And a lot of that makes our fake news look positively truthful. And so that it's been with us for a long, long time. But you know, we don't think perhaps in exactly the same way as the framers did. Samuel Chase, my person who got impeached, said there were only two ways to ruin a republic. One, luxury, and the second, the licentiousness of the press. And strangely, we don't talk about that much these days. But I'm a little more sanguine, I think, than you are, because William is right and you're right, that if you look at the mainstream media, it's pretty much tilted to the left, maybe even the far left. But the balance from the cable news networks and from the internet and from a lot of other places, I think is pretty powerful. It's a little harder to get away from pure fake news than it used to be, I think. I think we're seeing the evolution of new forms, and maybe we're seeing some counters. Nevertheless, I'd favor teaching the press a little bit of responsibility.
You know, at the outset of our republic, the notion of the free press did not refer to the free expression of ideas. It referred to the project of making the press as widely available for the sake of having an informed public as possible. And so that was accompanied in the initial administration of George Washington with vigorous efforts to assure building a comprehensive postal system through which the media would circulate without charge. That's how it was a free press. He wanted it to be as widely circulated as Facebook. And even though Washington suffered at the hands of scurrilous journalists who printed falsehoods, he never withdrew his endorsement of that proposition. He thought that this was essential for the republic in which people were governed, that they must be informed fully of what transpires in society and in their government in particular in order to exercise their responsibilities. And the cost of that is you have to expose yourself to the fake news. And in our times, we have to deal with an additional layer. We can refer to establishment journalism, understanding that what we mean by establishment is the growth of a barnacle crust over a superstructure which is corroding inside. And so we have that institutional problem with our media. It's encrusted and barnacled over, but that doesn't mean we don't need media. It doesn't mean we don't need a press. It just means we understand that these corporations, which is what they are, operate on the basis of their corporate interests and follow the particular slants along which they're organized. And it explains why the society has responded so well to the opportunities to communicate independently of it. Embracing cable news, embracing the internet, embracing Twitter sources and other social platforms. All of this is a reaction to this encrusted media of establishment journalism that we've experienced in the last 2 generations.
You mustn't forget that in the 1790s, we still had seditious libel laws.
Not until the end of the 1790s, and it didn't last long.
Actually,
And think about it this way. Well, we had seditious libel, but the Alien and Sedition Acts were different, yes.
Yeah.
So you always had the common law seditious libel.
Exactly.
But you did not have the vigorous enforcement of that common law seditious libel, which is why we got into trouble in 1798 with the Alien and Sedition laws, and which led to turning the Federalists out of office and electing Jeffersonian Republicans instead. So that even in that era, when there were still the common law practices, the disposition to wide open, transparent diffusion of commentary and information prevailed. And it seems to me it's the backbone of our society.
unless, of course, the Federalists weren't vigorous enough in their seditious libel laws, allowing the mendacious Jeffersonians to win the election.
Well, I would not deny the Jeffersonians were mendacious, but I would point out to you that, of course, they won only because the Supreme Federalist, Alexander Hamilton, in the end, came down on the side of those lying Republicans.
That's true.
Against the utterly corrupt and misshapen Burke, who would have been worse still.
That's right. I mean, and it was a problem with the slip to Adams Hamilton that led to that.
There were lots of problems that Mr. Adams had. We won't go into those. Who else? Yeah.
Back to the special counsel thing, maybe being unconstitutional. Is there any move afoot to start some lawsuits to maybe get it to the Supreme Court?
Well, it's been tried a little bit by Manafort and a few other folks, and it hasn't gone very far. The scholarship, not that it's tremendously important, and William may be right about the lack of impact of law professors overall, but the scholarship on the unconstitutionality of that particular iteration of special counsels is just beginning. And it'll probably need to mature for a little while before we finally see it. I wouldn't be surprised if it happens, though, because hindsight has proven that Scalia's dissent in the Morrison versus Olson case, which made the first suggestion on how this was unconstitutional, is now accepted as very wise. So I think it may happen eventually.
Now I must lodge a formal protest. I did not say the law professors are insignificant. I would never say that. I said judges don't matter. And it may be true every law professor wants to be a judge, but law professors are very significant.
More, if anything. Yes, sir.
It seems, or at least based on an article that I recently read, that one of the reasons it's become so partisan about the court is that for at least 50 years, Congress has abrogated its duty and become too partisan, and so they, instead of them deciding the abortion law, they pass it off on the courts, then come up with a Roe v. Wade. And we can come up with, hundreds of other examples, or they pass it off to the EPA or something to make the regulations.
Yeah, the
Congress will make a decision.
absolutely, growth of the administrative state, as you suggest, is one big reason. My own view is that a lot of this we can lay at the door of the Warren Court, who began to cut back on a lot of state authorities and eviscerated in some ways the power of the state legislatures that should have been making many more policies that the courts ended up making. I mean, it's a long, complex thing. And to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and to a law professor, everything looks like a legal problem and a jurisprudential problem. So the difficulty may be much bigger, but the Warren Court and its sea change of jurisprudence, I think, is a very big cause of the difficulties. Yes, sir.
I just want to say this is great fun because listening to you guys, and it's just about reason and thinking, critical thinking. And I was just noticing a young man in the front row. It's too bad we don't have more. Are you a student?
Yeah.
It's too bad we don't have more because this would be so fun for them, I think.
Yeah,
But I was going to ask, excuse me,
Yeah, go ahead.
if he wants to, if he has a comment or a question. Because I think.
I'm just here to.
I know the lady has a question.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are about the possibility of another Supreme Court justice being nominated during Trump's tenure.
Put it around 75%.
Positive.
Well, I might even,
Human life being what it is. Let's be candid about these things. We don't want to be morbid, but that somebody might leave in the next 2 years is a very real possibility, given just what the age is, how long they've served. Yeah, it's very hard. 6 years. And of course, if you think 6 years, it's almost certain.
yeah, I think 2 or 3 is not enough.
Yeah, not at all.
We can tell you who the next ones are going to be, too.
There's a list. There's a list.
Any other questions? Feel free. Got just a few more minutes left. We can wrap up. And you came with a great question, good job.
To continue on that last, but they could live to be 100. You never found one.
Yes, they could.
And they could be impeached.
No question.
Well, if there are 2 or 3 or however many in the next 4 or 6 years or whatever, will the Judiciary Committee and the Congress and everything will they modify their approach, or will it be the free-for-all it's been?
What a great question.
Don't you think that we are on a road to utter chaos?
Yeah.
And haven't you noticed over the years, each time a step is taken further in the direction of degradation, it becomes then the standard for the succeeding era, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. Now, we may have hit the bottom now, and it's not at all clear how you're going to recover from it. Just think about it. You hear people say, we're getting even from Merrick Garland, right? Well, Merrick Garland was not destroyed as a person. His character was not attacked. Nobody ever did that. The Republicans in the Senate had the power, and they used the power to deny him the office. That's politics. Now it's no longer where people who don't have the power still think they have the right, and they certainly have the opportunity to pull every chicane they can, including attacking the person's character. So they've shown a complete lack of honor, sense of honor, and decency, and you think they in turn are going to be the recipients of honor and decency? Well, that's asking a lot of human nature.
Like William, I think we've hit the bottom. I think it's bound to be a little better next time around. And especially if it turns out that Kavanaugh is confirmed, because then it's going to be a tactic that didn't work.
Yeah.
Even so. I should tell you one more historical anecdote. I mean, the idea of bringing the nominee before the Senate and making a show trial or a circus out of it, maybe we ought to abandon that. When Felix Frankfurter was nominated to the court. He was a teacher at the Harvard Law School. Franklin Roosevelt nominated him, and eventually became a justice. But he refused to appear at their hearings on the grounds that teaching his class was much more important. Still big hope.
Go ahead.
You may have begun to answer the question, but the question is, I think you've described it accurately, but what do you think it's going to take to turn it around and put it on another track?
As I said, confirming Kavanaugh at least help.
It's going to take, of course, not giving in, not surrendering. But that's going to require increasing fortitude and resolve on the part of a growing number of people in the society that sees back control. Yes, it's politics, but it's more than politics. It's character, it's moral principle. And so only if there's going to be an uprising that says we've had enough, we've gone as far as we can go, and we're not going to take it anymore, will there be a recovery. Nothing less than that will do.
What is that uprising?
It will come in many forms. It comes first of all by just becoming so stridently engaged politically and insisting upon putting in place representation that reflects the seriousness, the moral seriousness of the people of the community, that will begin to be the source, the spearhead that changes it all, that others will then have to be in control.
And I put it in similar words. The framers were desperately worried that the American people didn't have the virtue to sustain a republic. And we're going through a period now when we don't. If we ever, as William suggests, recover that, we'll be in better shape. It might be time to think about some constitutional amendments. It might be time to do term limits for Congress. It might be time to repeal the 17th Amendment. I mean, there's some things that we could try. We don't amend the Constitution enough. We should do that more often. These are all possibilities.
I mean, if the Democrats win the midterm elections and impeachment proceedings do start on President Trump, it sounded like that's what you feel will happen.
I think it might.
Do you think that will be before the end of the year? And certainly all hell's gonna break loose if that.
They wouldn't assume their office until next year.
Yeah, they won't be seated until January. No, that's when
Right.
that's when we start looking for real estate in other countries.
I mean, that.
Through the barricades.
So making the assumption that I don't think will happen, but if Kavanaugh was not seated and Trump had to nominate somebody else off of his list, who do you think would be willing to accept after this fiasco that we just?
What's her name?
Amy
Coney, yes. She would obviously be the choice at this point to respond to the politics that we've looked at.
Oh, but what will they do to her?
Oh.
Well, who knows?
Yeah.
But she'll be the next one.
Dianne Feinstein's already started on her.
Yes. Yes. This is the question I'm trying to destroy her too, but the fact of the matter is, they will end up with someone who is far more likely to challenge Roe v. Wade than Brett Kavanaugh ever was. That's going to be the outcome.
Lindsey Graham suggested we just re-nominate Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
You might,
Yeah.
What do you think about the convention of states? Do you think that's what we'll have to do?
I do.
I think that that's wildly improbable. I think it's going to have to work with ordinary political processes. The Convention of States would require, think about it, you know what it's like to organize for a referendum or initiative, right? And you got to do that in 3/4 of the states. And just think about the dimensions of that undertaking and how you keep it coherent and organized on that greatly dispersed federal foundation. So having a target that is not that dispersed is going to be a practical advantage. So that means, yes, we cannot back away from the reality that the federal government has emerged as a dominant political structure in our society, and targeting that means you have greater leverage without having to work through this greatly dispersed superstructure to try to get something done. It's just a practical matter. A convention of the states is the least likely thing that's going to happen. But building a majority, a solid majority in the Congress can happen. And targeting that is the most important thing to do.
I think you may have such a convention after that happens.
It could happen, but of course, if it originates in Congress, meaning getting both houses to call for amendments, my guess would be they had rather come up with the amendments themselves and call for a convention. If you have that kind of representation in the House and Senate, my guess is they would prefer to make the amendments rather than call for a convention of the states.
Refresh my memory, I think 3/4 of the states can call for it, and Congress is obligated to do it.
Yeah.
And that's an open question. That's a, look, these lawyers know this very well. They know when it comes to the Constitution, it's not a question of the text, it's a question of the practices. And it is very much an open question whether Congress is obligated, because that is not literally said in the text of the Constitution. It is implied. But remember, I said to you with regard to impeachment, the text says you must remove and bar. But what is the practice? Remove and maybe bar.
Let's not forget that William actually is a lawyer as well.